Welcome to the first class in our 7-week series of the Introduction to the Bible being presented at Unity Church of Winston-Salem. This class takes place on Sunday mornings at 9:30 a.m. and it is running from July 13th through August 23rd, 2026. Unfortunately, when we recorded the actual class this last Sunday, the audio didn't work, so I have re-recorded the lecture that I presented last Sunday. So if you are picking this course up later, you aren't missing any valuable information. So let's go ahead and get started. In the 21st century, the Bible is one of the oldest, most widely read, and most translated books in the world. If you were born and raised in the United States, you've had some exposure to beliefs and values of the Bible. Regardless of your religious leanings, the Bible and the religious beliefs found in the Bible influence both noticeably and subconsciously American culture, values, and even language. For Christians in the United States, the Bible is often used as a moral and ethical guide for how to behave rightly in the world. However, when the Bible was written, we 21st century Americans were not the intended audience. It was written about and for an entirely different audience. For this reason, before we begin our study of the Bible, we need to think about the influences of worldview, language, culture, and time. Of the 7,100 living languages in the world today, 3,658 languages have the Bible or some portion of the Bible translated for their use, with over 7 billion people having access to some portion of the Bible in their own language. This means over 7 billion people are potentially influenced by this text to some degree. The first influence that we need to clarify before we start reading the Bible is worldview. Worldviews are simply ways of understanding the world based on a set of beliefs and experiences. Our worldviews are formed by the families, our communities, and cultures we are raised within, as well as by the experience we have as we live our own lives. A white male who comes from a wealthy family will have a different worldview from a refugee who comes to the United States from a country experiencing years of civil unrest. And both of these people will have different worldviews from an African American female who was raised in the rural South. While they may have some beliefs and ideas in common about how the world works, for instance, perhaps they all are Christian, they will have many different beliefs and ideas about how the world works that are based on their geography, gender, race, and economic status. In the context of the Bible and when it was written, the worldviews are of a people whose main means of transportation was walking or riding a horse or donkey, or sitting in a cart being pulled by the same animals. Boats were another means of transportation, but those boats were powered by human muscle or sails. It took days to go miles, and most people did not travel far from their home regions because of the uncomfortable and often unsafe travel conditions. They did not have electricity, running water, refrigeration, radio, TV, internet, plastic, books in the form that we know them, free education for all, and for most, they did not have the freedom to choose what career they would pursue or who they would marry. They did not have science in the way that we know it today. Much of the world was unexplored, and exploring space was not even on the radar. In fact, the many mysteries of the world, such as natural events like the sun rising and setting, earthquakes, and rainstorms, were mysteries that were attributed mainly to the whims and powers of a god. Furthermore, the Bible itself spans hundreds of years in different geographies. The Hebrew people, who are the people of the Old Testament, have thousands of years of nomadic tribal culture before they were led to organize around a king and settle in cities. The culture of the New Testament, however, was largely urbanized and highly influenced by the Greek culture that Alexander the Great brought with him as he conquered the Mediterranean world. The culture, language, and worldviews of the people that the Bible was written about and for occur in this tiny square of land, much of which is the Mediterranean Sea. Today, this square of space makes up part of the Middle East, a territory that has been fighting for ownership of tribal land since before the Bible came into its written form. It also makes up parts of Europe, a very different culture from the Middle East, in that modern-day countries like Greece and Italy had more major cosmopolitan areas that were extremely influential, particularly in the New Testament. And that square also makes up parts of northern Africa, especially Egypt, which has a very rich culture and sophisticated religious traditions of its own. Zooming in even further, you can see just how small a piece of land we're talking about here. Israel is similar in size to New Jersey, it's a little smaller, but it's about twice the size of Rhode Island. And those measurements are at its peak when it claimed larger spaces of land. Yet for its small size, it has four distinct geographical regions. To the left, the Mediterranean coast consists of fertile coastal plains, which in ancient Near Eastern history were largely inhabited by groups of people who were not part of the Hebrew tribes, people like the Philistines or the Phoenicians. Moving inward, the second region is hill country. This is comparable to the Appalachian Mountains of the United States. Rolling hills and mountainous terrains, great grassy areas for flocks and herds of animals. Next to that is a largely barren strip of land in spaces, particularly southward. In the north, this area is much more fertile. This area is the Jordan Valley, Jordan River Valley, and it runs between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. On the other side of that, the hill country resumes, and it was historically claimed by both Hebrew tribes and non-Hebrew tribes and kingdoms such as the Moabites. Beyond this strip of land, further east, lies the desert to the east and to the south. This little strip of land was incredibly valuable. It provided one of the few passable places between the northern countries and the southern countries, and because of this, Israel was almost constantly in the uncomfortable position of being annexed by the larger kingdoms around them. Kingdoms such as Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt to the south, and Persia. This makes up much of the background of Israel's history. They were either being occupied or fending off occupation or creating uneasy alliances to hold off occupation. Let's turn our attention next to language. In an earlier slide, I showed a graphic with the vast number of languages the Bible or parts of the Bible have been translated into. The original languages of the Bible are anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 years old. The Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, although two small sections of the books of Daniel and Ezra were written in Aramaic, which is a spin-off of Hebrew, a cousin, you might say. The language you see under Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 on the screen is what biblical Hebrew looks like. It is written from the right to the left. Therefore, when you open a Hebrew Bible, the first page is the last page of the book, and you read from the back to the front. The original writings of the Old Testament were written on scrolls, not in a book form. This written language had no written vowels, apart from a few exceptions of consonants that sometimes stood in for a long sounding vowel. There were no spaces between words, and everything was written in capital letters. In the example you see on the screen, the Hebrew has markings around the letters and spaces between the words. This is the doing of scribes called the Masoretes, who transcribed the scrolls almost 1,000 years after they had originally been written down, adding spaces between words and developing a pointing system, which is the dots and lines you see around the letters that are supposed to take the place of vowel sounds. They also added punctuation to indicate where sentences ended. Following the Old Testament in the Bible is the Apocrypha, which is truly a transitional set of books between the Old and the New Testament. The original languages of the Apocrypha were a mix of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And finally, the New Testament was written in Greek, in what is called Koine Greek, which was the common dialect of Greek spoken throughout the various lands that Alexander the Great conquered. A third factor to consider is the difference in cultures between the original audience the Bible was written for and those of us studying it today. Merriam-Webster defines culture as the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. Likewise, culture is the characteristic features of everyday existence, such as a way of life, shared by people in a place or time. Why is culture important to recognize when thinking about the Bible? Because if you do not understand the culture in which something was written, then you cannot understand the meaning behind the words, and you take things literally that were meant to be figurative. For example, in today's American culture, LOL has a meaning that people who are not familiar with texting would understand. Likewise, in the Old Testament, the story of Joshua fighting in a battle contains a statement that the sun stood still. If one does not understand the culture and the language of the time, one could take this to mean that the sun literally stood still in the sky, when in fact this is a Hebrew colloquialism that means that Joshua was so caught up in the heat of battle that time seemed to slow down for him. Time didn't actually stop. The earth did not stop revolving. It just seemed to Joshua that time stood still because he was so caught up in the battle. Cultural differences to account for are the different ways men, women, and children were treated, who had rights and privileges that others did not have, what were taboo subjects, what were appropriate ways to interact with other people in public. Even things like garment colors also convey meanings that we would not think of today. For example, wearing a white garment during Jesus' lifetime meant that you were going to a party or a celebration. Other colors had significance too because of the costliness of getting hold of the special plants that provided the color. There are many important cultural clues that are lost to modern readers because we are unaware of the hidden meanings that were obvious to the original intended audience of the Bible. Time is the final factor to consider. I've already mentioned some differences that can be attributed to time, but as a reminder, the Bible is about groups of people and events in history that took place thousands of years ago. We have ways of referring to that time. Two popular ways are using the terms BC and AD, or else BCE and CE. In academic writing, it has become more common to use the terms BCE and CE, which mean before the Common Era and Common Era, as a way to be more neutral in referring to time when writing or speaking with audiences that may have different religious backgrounds. The terms BC and AD are also quite common in the Western world where Christianity has been the dominant religion. BC stands for the time before Christ, while AD is not short for after death, but instead is the Latin Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord, and refers to the time from Christ's birth and forward. Notice on the timeline that BC and BCE numbers to the left count down to 0, while CE and AD years count up from 0. The first century BC or BCE is from the year 100 to 0. The first century CE is the years 0 to 100. I've also included the 5 most important dates to remember in biblical history. There's actually 6. One is 1000 BCE, which is around the time that the United Kingdom of David and Saul and Solomon, that era began. 587 BCE, which is furthest to the left, was the first destruction of the Jewish temple, which Solomon built, and their forced dispersal from the land that God had given them. The year 323 BCE is Alexander the Great's conquest of much of the Mediterranean world, which also brought a unified language and safe roads connecting cities and towns. 33 CE, which is to the right, was the year believed to be the death and resurrection of Christ. 70 CE is the year the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans, the remains of which are to this day visited and revered as a holy site of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faiths. The year 325 CE was the year the Emperor Constantine recognized Christianity as a legitimate religion, and the Council of Nicaea met to formalize the beliefs of this new religion. Among the things accomplished at this council were the formalization of the Nicene Creed and the decision to adopt the idea of the Trinity as a part of the dogmatics of the Church. I also included the number 0, which is the designated point on the timeline where Christ was born. However, it's not worth noting that historians have since come to believe that history places Jesus' birth somewhere between 6 and 2 BCE. We've talked about some factors to take into consideration when reading or studying the Bible. Now let's take a closer look at the writing of the Bible itself. We'll go into more detail at different points through the classes. So at this point, I'd simply like to provide you with some general information to give you a foundation to build on. So there's 3 things that you need to know about the Bible. What's in it, who wrote it, and how long did it take to write it? The Bible is actually a compilation of holy texts for 2 religions, Judaism and Christianity. The Old Testament is known as the Hebrew Scriptures among the people of Jewish faith. It's also called the Tanakh, which is an acronym, TNK, for the different groupings of books within the scriptures. Tanakh stands for Torah, the Hebrew word that means law, which covers the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. In Christian traditions, the Torah is also known as the Pentateuch. Nevi'im is the Hebrew word for prophets, and this section includes the books of the Old Testament that covered the time in history that the prophets were intermediaries for God. These include 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings, and all the prophetic books, both the major prophets and what are called the minor prophets, or the 12. Major prophets include Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. Ketuvim means writings, and it covers what are known as the wisdom books, as well as some other histories and books of prophets. It's important to emphasize that if you look at the Tanakh, which is a complete book on its own that is used by those of the Jewish faith, these books are grouped differently than they are grouped in the Old Testament of the Bible. Regardless of their groupings and order, all 39 of these books make up the Old Testament. Authorship of the Old Testament is the subject of much scholarly attention. There are several theories about the authorship of the Old Testament. These theories are based on analyzing the writing, the use of words or phrases or turns of speech, the historical knowledge the writer appeared to have, and the bias that the writer writes with. The consensus is that the Old Testament books were written by many different writers over several hundred years of time. The first 5 books, which in religious communities are often attributed to Moses, have been pretty decisively found by scholars to have been authored by multiple groups of people. There are several theories. For example, one well-known theory is the documentary hypothesis, which states that the first 5 books of the Bible were not written entirely by Moses, who died in the 1400s BC, but also by different authors and compilers after Moses. The theory is based on the fact that different names for God are used in different portions of the Pentateuch, and there are detectable differences in linguistic style. JEDP stands for the 4 supposed authors or groups of authors. J stands for the Yahwist, who uses Yahweh, which is often translated as Jehovah, for God's name. E is the Elohist, who uses Elohim for God's name. D is for the Deuteronomist, who authored the book of Deuteronomy and perhaps parts of the other books such as Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And P stands for the priestly author of Leviticus and other parts of the Old Testament. The documentary hypothesis goes on to state that the different portions of the Pentateuch were likely compiled in the 4th century BC, possibly by Ezra. The rest of the books of the Old Testament are likewise mysterious. It's doubtful that any one person wrote them, but rather they are collections from various writers that have been gathered together across time and edited into various works. You will see this as we look at stories in the Old Testament that appear to be the same story, but are told twice. For example, the homework that you have this week is to look at the 2 stories of creation that take place in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. Another story is the story of the flood that actually is multiple stories of the flood. Now that I've thoroughly confused you, here's the simple answer to who wrote the Old Testament. Several people over hundreds of years wrote the Old Testament. The Apocrypha is a set of 14 books that were written later in Jewish history around 400 to 200 BCE. Several of the books were written in Hebrew or Aramaic originally, and then later translated to Greek, while the rest were originally written in Greek. They consist of stories, poems, history, and apocalypses. From a female perspective, it's in the Apocrypha that we find stories specifically about heroic Jewish women who did incredible things as a result of their faith. Apocrypha means hidden. Generally, this was understood that there were hidden meanings within the stories told. It only came to mean books outside the biblical canon during the Protestant Reformation, many centuries after the books of the Apocrypha were written, and that is why Protestant Bibles do not include the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha was also written by numerous authors over a 200-year span of time. The only book whose author is known by name is the book entitled Ecclesiasticus, which is also known as Sirach, because the author was Jesus, son of Sirach. We know this because his grandson, Ben Sira of Jerusalem, translated the original Hebrew document into Greek and wrote a prologue. This book is entirely based on ethical teachings. The New Testament is a lot easier to tackle. It covers a much shorter span of history, from the birth of Christ to the establishment of Christian groups throughout the Mediterranean world. It consists of 4 types of literature: the Gospels, which are the accounts of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ; Acts, which is an account of the events following Jesus' death and resurrection and how the apostles carried on his work. The epistles are instructional letters, which are claimed to have been written by apostles of the early church after Jesus' death. And the last book of the Bible, called the Revelation of John, falls under the literary genre of an apocalypse. Apocalypse means revelation, but it is a specific kind of revelation. It uses a supernatural being who reveals cosmic mysteries or the future to a human intermediary. These revelations came through dreams, visions, and heavenly journeys, and they usually include symbolic imagery as well as pessimistic views of history, the division of time into periods, the use of numerology, and claims of ecstatic experiences. Almost all apocalypses are written under false names, using a famous hero from the past as the author to lend credibility to the prophecies of the future that are included in the book. For example, the Old Testament book of Daniel is an apocalypse. It was composed during the 2nd century BCE, but it bears the name of the legendary Daniel from the 6th century BCE to convince its writers that it was written by Daniel 4 centuries earlier. Because it was actually written 400 years after Daniel actually lived, it is able to put predictions of the future into Daniel's mouth that are actually historical events that the real writer knows about up to the recent past. The writer can therefore make predictions about what is coming. Often those are end of world or end of life as we know it scenarios. And because most of Daniel's predictions accurately describe events that happened after Daniel's death until about 200 BCE, readers bought into the predictions about things that have not actually yet happened. This is the case for all apocalyptical literature, including the Revelation of John in the New Testament. One final note about this book: it's a personal pet peeve of mine to see anyone write or talk about the Revelations. The title of the book in the Bible is The Revelation of John. It is one revelation, so remember that when you're referring to it. As far as the authorship of the New Testament, again, there are many authors. Paul, for instance, wrote a number of epistles. However, there are several epistles attributed to Paul that scholars have proven are not actually written by Paul. The author of Luke also authored Acts, and each of the Gospels were written by different individuals attributed to the apostles Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Revelation is attributed to a John as well, although there has been some disagreement as to which John that might be. The time frame of these writings is relatively short compared to the rest of the Bible. Earliest writings are probably around 20 years after Jesus' death in the 50s CE, and latest writings can be placed as late as 120 CE. The rich history of the Old Testament was passed down in oral form or in fragments of written form for hundreds and hundreds of years. It is believed that one of the earliest fragments of the Old Testament is not in Genesis, but a prayer that every Jewish person was to recite when they brought their first produce from the harvest before God during the festival of Shavuot. This passage is on the screen. Deuteronomy 26, verses 5 through 10. This festival is a first harvest festival, but it also is a commemoration of when God entered into a covenant with the Hebrew people. To this day, this passage is recited during this festival. A wandering Aramaean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians treated us harshly and humiliated us and laid on us hard labor. Then we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great deeds of terror, with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And behold, now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground, which you, O Lord, have given me. The first concentrated attempt to bring the oral traditions into written form took place when the Hebrew people were exiled from their land in 587 BCE. With the loss of their homeland, they feared their history would be lost, and the oral traditions began to be written down. The Torah, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were the first committed to paper, most likely during the Hebrews' exile from the land after 587 BCE, and the rest of the Old Testament gradually was written down over the next 5 centuries. Scholars cannot agree on when exactly the Old Testament reached a final format that became canon. They speculate that canonization occurred somewhere between the 2nd and 1st century BCE. Canon, by the way, means rule or measuring stick. To canonize a religious text means to say that it is in its final form, recognized as Holy Scripture, and will not be changed. It becomes the rule of the religion. Around the 3rd century CE, the final form of the Bible, with agreement on what books made up Old and New Testament and Apocrypha, was recognized as divinely inspired by God. To kind of recap, when we're looking at the Old Testament, which we'll be doing for the next 2 weeks, there are some contrasts and conflicts that make up themes and are underlying all of the stories that you read. So here's contrast to remember. There's a contrast between finding God within yourself and finding God through prescribed worship led by a priest. There's a contrast between community rule and the rule of the monarchy. There's a struggle between nomadic independence and urban settlement, and a contrast of monotheism, one God, with polytheism or pantheism. There's a contrast between separation from other groups and absorption into other groups. And there's a struggle between traditions of sacrifice, including child sacrifice, and non-sacrificial traditions. So to recap, before you read anything in the Bible, it's important to remember that you're reading about people from a different time, a different geographical location, who have a very different culture and worldview than yours. And those factors influence the way history and the people in that history are presented. Because it was written in a different language, there are also many hidden meanings that are lost in translation that would have given different information to those who spoke that original language. These are all important considerations to remember when we study the Bible as a historical document or attempt to apply things we read in the Bible to our personal lives today.